Darklings. So today I wanted to talk about the life of a bibliophile or a book lover. And this is kind of a generalized kind of deal. This is sort of my experience with it. This isn't how it always is for everybody, but this is just pretty much my feelings on being a book lover. So growing up, I was one of the few people in my family who did do a lot of reading, mostly because people in my family are more active, would go out and actually do things and have social events, which I had no interest in, and I preferred to be by myself and would either be drawing or reading. Mostly reading as a kid because I wasn't that good at drawing for a long time until years of practice. But I was one of those kids that liked to carry a book around with me even if I never got the chance to read it. In fact, I still do that. Like today, I carried around a couple of books that I knew I wouldn't have time to read, but couldn't leave them at home because they would be lonely. Book lovers, or certainly avid ones, apparently have a concept that books are alive, because they certainly are to me. I don't know if you think that, but I've always thought of books as having kind of a life inside of them, especially the older ones. Like these beat up little paperbacks, The Lord of the Rings. My stepdad got these in the early 70s when he was living in a trailer park in Nevada working on a construction site. And so the pages all have the super soft edges and they're a little yellowed and they're slightly beat up, but they have more character that way. They have more story in them than just the written word. I always love that. Here's like an older beat up. It has stickers from multiple thrift stores kind of deal. They have like bits of pencil writing in them, the soft edges with little nicks and tears on them. That being said, I also like collecting the super pretty leather-bound ones that smell like leather and book glue, and I don't get the chance to read them as often because they're so bulky I can't really take them with me. They're more a curl up on a rainy day with a nice hot cup of tea kind of book. And being a book lover is kind of funny because it makes it feel like you're the only one who thinks this way. And for a long time I kind of thought I was the only one who was like super book nerdy until I met other people who were too. And one of the ways you can tell that someone reads a lot or is familiar with reading is their vocabulary. I have a tendency to use a lot of big words. I can be a little loquacious. I like using my vocabulary because I spend so much time reading. It's pretty easy to tell if someone doesn't read because vocabulary is narrowed down a little bit. And I like words. I like using them. I like writing with them. I just really like words, and apparently I completely throw people off a lot and get made fun of for using big fancy ass words, which is silly, but not all my coworkers and friends read as much as I do and as I did, and oh well, it happens. I think it's kind of funny because my brother, who is a year and a half younger than I am, he grew up the very sporty type, played all kinds of sports, hung out with his friends, and read very little. And sometimes we will have conversations, and I will use a word that he is unfamiliar with, and so he's kind of swallowed his ego a little bit, and he's gotten in the habit of asking what it means so that he can learn it instead of just doing the smile and nod. What the fuck is that word? I don't know. And I think it's definitely helped his vocabulary. And I really do love people who are avid readers and read all kinds of varieties of books. I know that most of the books I grew up with were more fantasy related. Now I've kind of branched out in a lot of different directions, and I spent kind of a year reading almost nothing but memoirs and biographies, usually for the majority of them being musicians, most of them punk musicians from 1970s New York, and kind of dedicated a big chunk of research to that. But I also am a research junkie, and I love learning new things because that's the best way to keep creative momentum for me. And books just kind of are their own magic, and they have character, and they're made of characters, and they're written by somebody else who's probably a character to come up with all these characters. And I just have such a fascination with stories because it's such an unusual and such an unbelievably human thing. And I will always be fascinated by that, and I like trying to gather and collect stories because that's one of my favorite things to collect, because you're collecting something that is both physical and abstract, and that's me. I don't know if other people think that way, but I know that's how I do. I always want to encourage people to read, and I know for some people it's more difficult. I know one of my friends, he likes to read, but he does have dyslexia, and it makes it very difficult for him to read well or and to read quickly. I know that my mother is a very slow reader, which ended up benefiting her as an editor, but makes it very difficult for her to read fiction books because it takes her forever. I mean, I managed to go through 1,500 pages in 3 days, and it took her 5 days to get through a 250-page book because she was editing the whole way through. And so that always can prove as a difficulty, and I have had friends in the past who are much, much, much faster readers than I am and can go through a 1,000-page book in a day. I can't quite do that, but I am a pretty avid reader, and sometimes I do reread, but I'm trying to break that habit because there are so many things out there that I haven't read. But sometimes visiting an old story or going back to something I've read before, it's kind of like coming home to a friend, and it's a sense of comfort. So that's just me. And it's probably other people too. And it's nice to kind of do book swap ideas with other people. The thing is, it's easy for me to do movie recommendations because a movie is a set amount of time. I can give you the name of a film, and that film is always going to be 2 hours and 6 minutes. It's not going to take everybody a certain number of hours and minutes to read a book, and books are more time consuming. As much as I love them, they are very immersive and single focus. I love film because I can turn it on and I multitask. And that's why I've seen so many movies as I'm working while movies are playing. I still am able to pay attention to them quite well, but that's from practice, and it's the number one reason I don't play video games and can't play video games is it's too immersive and I don't have time. And if I'm going to be doing something that's immersive and audience participation, I'd rather be reading because I find it far more interesting than a game. And I like the concept of world building, and I like the idea of there being people that both exist and don't exist. And so fictional characters are interesting that way because they're real because they've been written out on paper and ink, but they also aren't real because they're not physically standing in front of you or standing in front of a screen until someone makes it so. And I always like that idea of why fiction is so interesting. I always want to encourage my viewers, if at all possible, to read, because reading really is cool, and I find it a little disheartening when I have a couple of my coworkers that are like, oh, reading is stupid, I've probably read 4 books in my life, and they brag about it, and I find that really sad because books have been a very, very large part of my life, and I was a bibliophile for years before I ever even thought about having any interest in film. So all the films and all the movies and TV shows and stuff I've been watching has been more or less in the past 8 years, but for the first 15 years it was more reading for me. So, pick up a book when you have the time, because I know it can be really difficult to make time for reading, but I really, really do suggest it. Till next time, Darklings.